How do you manage and prevent destructive conflict in the workplace? This is the Leaders of Transformation podcast. And on this show, we interview difference makers and world changers who are transforming for good. Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Nicole Jansen, and our guest today is Jeremy Pollack. He is a leader in the field of workplace conflict resolution and peace building, and he is the author of the book, The Conflict Resolution Playbook, which we're going to talk about today. And we're going to talk about what creates conflict in the workplace and practical ways to resolve it. Now, before we go any further, I want to do a shout out to Amy from Expert Bookers because she is the one that recommended Jeremy as a guest. And I always like to thank those that support this show. And that is also you that is listening. Thank you for being here. We're so glad that you're tuning in. This podcast is actually brought to you by my coaching and training company. So if you are a leader who wants to be better, do better, and have a greater impact in the world, then I encourage you to book a free consult with me. We'll discuss your goals, your opportunities, and really what it takes to create a breakthrough so you can become the leader of transformation that you are capable of being. So you can go to leadersoftransformation.com/coaching and click on the scheduling link provided. All right, let's bring our guest on. Jeremy, welcome to Leaders of Transformation. We're glad to have you here today.
Thanks, Nicole. Really happy to be here.
So this topic that we're going to talk about is really a hot topic, especially right now, because there's a lot of conflict in this socio-political environment that we're in is kind of adding to that. But let's start off with, before we get too far into it, let's start off with what creates conflict in the first place.
Sure. Well, I mean, I tend to think about conflict through a human needs perspective. And that's sort of a framework that several conflict resolution theorists have proposed and have used in practical ways. So I look at 6 basic psychological needs and how those are being satisfied. And my goal as a peace builder is to figure out which of those needs are being or are perceived as being threatened or impeded by the parties in conflict, and how to help them satisfy those needs, mitigate the perception of the threat to those needs. So we really want to look at those needs, do a little bit of analysis, and figure out how do we make sure that everybody's needs are getting met here. And those needs are manifested in goals, in values, in or organizational culture. They're manifested in different ways. But really at the core of it, the underlying needs, the basic psychological needs of individuals have to be satisfied to a certain level in order to create peace in those individuals. And that's really what I'm looking at.
Got it. So when they're not getting their needs met, how do we create an environment where we can transform that so that they can, first of all, I guess you have to identify what those needs are that are at risk, and then create the environment. So how do we go about doing that?
Well, I'll give you the 6 needs that I tend to look at. I've done a lot of research in this field. I've been in the field of peace psychology for quite a while, and before that, sort of anthropology and looking at group cooperation and conflict, and I've done a lot of research from different fields in human needs theories. And these 6 psychological needs seem to be pretty robust in terms of the research. And then on top of those, what economists and psychologists sometimes call satisfiers are the things, the action items, the behaviors, the cultural mechanisms that are in place to actually satisfy those needs. So what I look at is, what psychological needs in individuals in the org, because every organization is a network of individuals. What psychological needs at the individual level are being satisfied or threatened or impeded in some way? And then how are the cultural satisfiers of the organization meeting those? And I look at particularly 10 what I call organizational satisfiers. So the basic psychological needs that I measure and that you could kind of analyze yourself would be autonomy, identity, safety, stimulation, growth, and connection. And we can talk more about that. But those are the basic needs. And when we do measurements on those, we measure them using 4 to 5, like a subscale for each, that each contains kind of 4 to 5 questions. And then on top of that, we have these 10 organizational satisfiers: trust, inclusion, fairness, clarity, transparency, feedback, appreciation, accountability, consistency, and clarity. I think I said clarity again, but so those are the 10 that we tend to measure in the organization at an organizational level. And if those are being implemented at a high levels, a lot of times we'll see basic psychological needs being satisfied, at least by the organization. So those are the important elements to measure.
So the first thing is you measure it, you assess it, and you have a tool that does that.
Yes.
That's what I'm assuming. And then an organization can determine and start to roll out a plan to what culturally do they need to shift in terms of that. Now,
yeah,
is there a time where conflict is a good thing?
Sure. Yeah, I mean that's one thing that is a major paradigm shift that we tend to that I tend to teach organizations and help whether I'm working with leadership at an organization or I'm working with individuals who are in conflict at an organization, is getting them to reframe how they think about conflict. Conflict is a lot of times uncomfortable. And so what we want to try to avoid is destructive conflict, but there's also an opportunity for creative conflict. And there's a theory, and I would propose that there's some truth to this theory, that all conflict, all tension, all friction is the catalyst for innovation, growth, and change, for positive change. So we don't make large positive changes or innovate or be really creative without some amount of friction. And so I think if we start reframing and say, this conflict that you're in, this can be a good thing. This is an opportunity to really grow in your relationship with this other individual or with the company or with your customer base or something like that. This is an opportunity for you to learn and to grow. If we don't think of it like that, and if we just go, we don't like it, we don't want to avoid it, we want to get away from it, we want to fight, if we look at it like that, then it becomes destructive conflict, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
So I'm going to go on a tangent here because that brought up something that obviously right now, like we were talking about the fact that even this socio-political environment that we're in right now, there's a lot of conflict.
Yeah.
There's a lot of confrontation.
As there's always been.
There's a lot of canceling and all of that. So I want to talk, I would love to hear your thoughts on this in terms of how do we resolve this? Like if people are just going, okay, we can talk about the workplace, but I'm seeing it just in my day to day with people that think differently than me. And you talked about the opportunity specifically and what the opportunity is in that.
Okay, so that's a really good question. I'm gonna make a distinction here between conflict and escalation. So conflict is very normal and natural. We're always going to have conflicts in our lives come up from time to time with different entities, whether it's an organization or a person or some group of people or something like that. And there's opportunities there, and conflict's not a bad thing. It could be a good thing. When it becomes destructive is as a result of escalation. And what that means is people are emotionally triggered. People are emotionally escalated. When people are emotionally escalated, they are in their acute stress response, their fight flight response. They cannot, their logical their higher conscious, their higher brain thinking, their logical thinking kind of goes offline, and they're purely in emotion and intuition at that point. And it's very hard to reason with people. It's very hard to make creative conflict work. We're in probably destructive conflict. So we need to try to make sure that we're de-escalated so that when we're in conflict, we can actually have conversations. We can use logic, we can reason with each other, et cetera. But it's really hard when we're escalated. And the question, well, how do we get out of it? How do we de-escalate? The main thing for me, in terms of when I train people in de-escalation, escalation or emotional escalation is a result of people not feeling heard, valued, seen, respected, considered. Okay, so like they're not feeling, essentially a form of dehumanization. You and I may be in a conflict, but if you're actually listening to me and I bring to you and I say, this is really bothering me and I have a problem. If you're listening to me, maybe you're doing some reflective listening, like you're hearing me, you're repeating back what you're hearing. You're saying you're trying to align with me in some way. I can see why you would feel that way. That makes sense to me. How do we figure this out? I'm feeling heard. That's okay. That conflict leads to a place where we can actually have an opportunity. If you immediately defend, reject, dismiss, ignore me, et cetera, and I don't feel heard or listened to, that's when escalation happens. And so you can see this everywhere right now in socio-political atmosphere. You can see that people are very escalated because they don't feel like they're being considered or heard at all. They're feeling like the other side, the opponents or whatever, they're just completely dismissing us. They're calling us stupid or crazy or ignorant or bad or evil or something like that. It's complete dismissal. And so that makes me escalated and I just want to fight or flight or whatever. But if we were actually able to listen to each other, to have communication where I could hear the other side and they would become de-escalated and they could tell me their side and I could hear their side and vice versa, then we're having a conversation. Then we can actually get somewhere, because a lot of times when we find ourselves in conflict, if we're staying in a logical space and we can actually reason with each other, what we'll find is we actually have a lot of the same values, a lot of the same underlying interests and needs. And we just have different ways that we think we ought to go about them. So I think my family, I want my family to stay safe. And the way that I think my family should stay safe is I want to have a lot of guns. And I think I have the right to have a lot of guns because the Constitution says so, et cetera. And the other person says, I want my family to stay safe. But the way that I think we need to get there is we need to get rid of all the guns, because the guns are what's making it dangerous, et cetera. And so you have different approaches to getting to the same underlying goal. We both want our families to stay safe. So now we're aligning on some basic level here. Let's start negotiating and maybe being creative and thinking outside the box about our original positions, about the methods by which we can keep our families safe. But that only happens when we're de-escalated.
You're talking my language, because, talking about seeking to understand. And I believe that we all ultimately, with maybe some exceptions that may have some mental health or whatever, some psychopaths or whatever, but pretty much everybody wants to love and be loved. They want to,
absolutely.
They want their families, whoever is their loved ones, they're people that are important to them. They want them to have a good life. And we can all agree on that. Now, like you said, it's the how we get there is what people disagree on. Yeah. And whether it's guns or whether it's not, or whether we need to kill this group because they're the ones that are causing they're putting my family in jeopardy, or whatever the case is. So I love this. I love this. Now, with that, what I hear and I notice, because even on social media, and I know we're going to come back to the workplace in a moment, but this really applies. Awesome. It applies to all of it. Is you can hear someone, you can acknowledge them, but it's almost like there's this collective, I haven't been heard collectively. So it matters that you acknowledge me, but actually but it's almost not enough to de-escalate it, because because they're so wound up about all of the emotion from everything else going on in the world. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah. So how do we as individuals have someone feel safe and feel heard and valued when there's so much escalation that's actually happened from the media and from all of their other prior experience that they're dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, here I'm gonna make a radical proposal, and I've implemented this, and it's making a wild change. If you want more peace if you want more peace in your life, remember, we have to satisfy those basic psychological needs, and impediments or perceived threats to those needs are going to make us feel like we're not in a state of peace. If peace is our goal, to get to a state of peace with each other, with ourselves, then we should try to figure out how to mitigate the threats to our needs. One of those threats to our needs is if you are experiencing or witnessing tension, violence, aggression, etc., right in front of you, that's going to affect you negatively and create a state of imbalance or a lack of peace, conflict internally. I find that when I'm on social media and I'm looking through things and I'm witnessing people intense conversations, like on chats or whatever, or like in what what are they called, posts and that kind of thing, or if I'm watching the news and people are fighting or they're telling how bad the other side is or something like that, that puts me at a state of conflict internally. And so my radical proposal is shut off the news and get off of social media as much as you possibly can. I've completely taken all social media down. I only am on LinkedIn a little bit because I need to for work, but I don't watch any news anymore. I don't, so my wife isn't as affected as I am. And so she filters it and kind of tells me if there's anything I really need to know, because it's going to affect us here and where I live. But other than that, I just don't find any need for it. And I'm at a way better state of peace. So I would say that doing de-escalation work or doing conflict resolution in social media or online is not you. It's a losing battle. You're setting yourself up for failure. Do this in the world. Go out and talk to people talk to individuals, meet people from other quote unquote groups, talk to them, and you'll find probably that it's much different in the real world than it is in the media or in social media, because those platforms thrive on threat and fear. That's how they get clicks. And so we want to, if I want to be at a state of peace, I don't want to be involved in all this threat and fear. So I go out into the world, and when you're talking to people in the world and you start to sense that maybe there's a difference in values or goals and there's a conflict. Again, if we want to stay de-escalated and you want to make sure people feel heard and seen and valued, try to listen and repeat and try to align. Those are the things that I sort of like the core of what I teach is listen and repeat and align, which is I listen to what they're saying. I paraphrase back what I hear in a very natural way, so it doesn't sound scripted. So they feel like I heard them. And then I find something that I heard that I can align with. That's actually really important. That idea is actually, you're right. That's very concerning to me too. I want that for your family too. I want to feel safe too. Somewhere I can agree with them and align it. And from that point, then we can start to talk about, but have you thought about this over here? What do you think about this? You know what I mean? So they feel that we're on the same page first. We're on the same team. We're not opponents. And then I can start to, maybe create some questions if I need to.
Yeah, that's so good. That's so good. And they start opening up a little bit to listening to your point of view because you've already heard their point of view.
Absolutely.
And acknowledged it. So that's really, really good. Thank you. Now, let's talk about the importance of I and you statements. When a lot of times people will be attacking, you talk about the defense, we get on, it's like, you always, or you never, or, why do you, versus the I statements about how can you maybe unpack that a little bit? Because I notice a lot of times, and I have a lot of clients who I'll remind them and say, okay, you're saying you, turn it into I. So this is a disassociation, right? I don't, they don't want to connect to it. And so I notice this a lot with people. I'd love to hear your perspective.
they teach these I messages they also call them assertion messages. There's different like 2-part assertion, 3-part assertion, 4-part assertion messages, and they teach them in nonviolent communication. And essentially the idea is that I don't want to accuse someone or judge someone or character assassinate someone by saying they did something wrong or bad, or they're a bad person or something like that. So I make it all about the way that I am feeling or I'm experiencing some event or behavior. I do think it's usually appropriate to say when you did XYZ, and you can but be very specific. It's not an abstract, vague appraisal of their behavior. It's very specific. Hey, when you talked over me at that meeting the other day, when we were talking about that one topic, and then you started kind of, every time I talked, you started interrupting me. Did you notice that you did that? And yeah, okay. So when you do that, I interpret it as you're not wanting to hear what I'm having to say. And maybe that my perspective isn't as valued as much. Is that true? Is that what you were intending? Or did you not notice that? So you're telling them how I experienced it, how it impacted me, but then you're opening up a conversation. You're not just saying you did this and it made me feel that way and that's bad. You're saying when you did this, I interpreted it that way. It sat with me this way. I felt that way about it. Can you tell me what you were experiencing? Can you tell me, did you notice that you did that? Did you notice that I was kind of withdrawn after that or something? So you're opening up a collaboration, a discussion about it.
Beautiful. Yeah. Thank you. I love that. And it's the subtlety of your words. And I know you talk about it in your book. And so I'm going to plug your book, the Conflict Resolution Playbook. We talked about, mentioned that in the beginning as well. I would recommend our listeners go get a copy of that book. It's fantastic. It's very practical, by the way. Thank you for that. There's a lot of like, here's what you can do in these scenarios. And in there, what I notice is you talk about tonality, you talk about language and body language and all of that, but like the words we speak, and of course, communication is not just the words we say, it's how we say it. And so
mostly how we say it.
Mostly how we say it. Yeah. And so when you were talking there and even just using the words, and this is how I interpreted it, but it was your tonality was non-defensive or confronting, attacking,
right.
And really kind of leaning back, if you will, and just saying how, or leaning in, but from the curiosity standpoint. So I love that. You also talk about in your book, the conversation protocol and how do we create that kind of, we're starting to talk about it here in terms of language and so forth, but how do you create a kind of protocol for people if they're going to go into a situation what are some of the things that they need to take into consideration? Maybe somebody that is at work and, they're like, how do I address this? Or how can I create conversation protocol that can avoid the conflict in the first place?
Well, okay. So I use a communication sequence that I call BEAR, but I think in this case, I have one called BEAR, which is behavior, effect, ask, and request. But then I also add in an I sometimes in there, depending on if there's an emotional component to it. It's called behavior, interpretation, effect, ask, and request. And so what that means is whenever I know that I'm going to go into a conversation, I'm going to give someone some feedback on their behavior, let's say, because they did something where they're like kind of doing something that I'm not comfortable with, or it's making me feel weird or something like that, and I need to confront them about it. I want to do a little bit of upfront analysis before I go in. I don't want to just kind of go in a cold. And I want to separate out what the behavior is from my interpretation of that behavior. So that's really important, because if I don't do that, it's very likely that I'm going to go in there and I'm going to sound accusatory, like they've done something bad and wrong, they're bad and wrong, and they need to apologize or something like that. Sometimes maybe that's the truth, but a lot of times it's really, I find that conflict most of the time is a miscommunication or a misperception of some sort. And we just need to get some clarity, what that behavior actually meant, what they actually intended versus how I interpreted it. So I do a little bit of analysis. What was the behavior that I'm talking about? I want to be really specific about it. And what was my interpretation of it? And how did it affect me or the company or the team or something? What was the result of it? Okay. And then I'm going to open up a question. Did they experience that too? And then finally I make a request. So that's the sequence that I typically use. And if I think that it might trigger someone based on their personality, I'll probably start with a positive, and that positive will be something that directly addresses the thing I think might get triggered. So if I was going to come in and tell someone they're micromanaging me too much, and I was going to say, when you, and I don't want to say when you micromanage me, because that's a judgment and that's vague. But when you say, like, when you want to get, in the Friday meetings, when you want to go over every single line that I've written to see if we can tweak it. Okay. So that's how I would construe micromanaging. When you want to go over every single line, I interpret it as you not really trusting that I can do my job very well. And I'm starting to feel a little bit like, demotivated as a result. And I just want to know, do you trust me to do my job? Do you think that I'm competent in this? And so again, I'm coming in with a spirit of curiosity, not a spirit of accusation. You've done something wrong here, but a spirit of, here's what you're doing. Here's how I'm interpreting it. Here's how it's affecting me. Do you realize that it's doing that? Or do you intend that? Or do you trust me? Do you actually think I'm competent? So you're opening that space up for them to go, of course I do. I'm only doing this because, because it's affecting me and I needed to do it. And I thought you wanted me to do that. And no, so like getting some clarity. Oh, okay. So that's why you did it. Actually, no. So I'd rather do it on my own and then come to you and we can work something out. How about this? And make that request. So that's really important. That sort of sequence: behavior, interpretation, effect, ask, and request. So that would be an important, I think, sequence, and starting with a positive when necessary. And the positive could sound something like this: listen, you're a great manager, and I know you trust me. But when you in Friday meetings, when you actually look at my work and you want to go through everything, it feels to me like maybe you don't trust me. Is that true? Do you trust me? So you could start off with the thing like, you are a great leader. You are really good at what you do. I really respect you. And I know you do trust me. And I know we have a good rapport. And I want to have a good relationship, of course. When you do this in those Friday meetings, this is how it interprets. So you can start off with a positive that kind of directly counteracts the potential defensive reaction.
Yeah. And I know that there's a lot of people that have learned over the years the sandwich model. I also know that irritates a lot of people because they feel like they're being set up with that. But I like this because you're actually genuinely, and a lot of times that sounds very insincere when they're trying to sandwich, which is the good, the good, the bad, the good kind of thing. And actually some cultures completely hated that. I understand that, like German people, my mother was German. They don't like that. They want you to be straight with them. Don't fluff it.
Eastern Europeans in general, I find to be like, they want to be much more blunt. They don't,
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Well, and this actually speaks to, I know diversity is obviously really important. You mentioned about inclusion earlier, as one of the values or things that are important. So how is the best way to honor diversity in the workplace as it relates to what we're talking about here? Because people are going to have different cultural experiences and sort of frameworks that they're used to.
Yeah.
And even just like, I mean, whether it's cultural, whether it's gender, whether it could be anything,
Right,
but we have different
right.
ways that we see things.
Yeah, I think one of the mistakes that I see right now happening in society is this massive DEI push right now is making assumptions about the way that all human beings think and operate, and they're bringing that into organizations and going, we know that everybody here has implicit bias, and so we're going to directly address that or something like that. We know that this is existing, and I don't think there's any good evidence to suggest that everybody thinks a certain way and believes certain things. Certainly, there's lots of research in intergroup contact and intergroup prejudice and that kind of thing, but I don't know that actually results in discriminatory behavior all the time. So what I would suggest is I take everybody at an individual and every organization at an individual level. So if we're going to come in and we want to measure how we're doing in diversity, we want to measure how people are feeling about diversity, how inclusive we are, et cetera. I would measure in that organization. I would say, let's take some, whether it's a survey or do some interviews or some combination of that, of how people are feeling about diversity in the company, diversity initiatives, where they're feeling things are, if there is any feeling of unfairness anywhere about things. Let's measure it, because we can't assume that it's happening. We want to actually ask people, and that is an inclusive process because we're actually getting input from people. And then, we have a whole process when we do organizational assessments, when we do the interviews and surveys, and after the assessment, we actually do a presentation for the whole staff that have participated, so they can then facilitate a dialogue around what the findings were, so they have some input around the findings and potential solutions for those. And so it's a very inclusive process of figuring out where the hot spots are in an organization and how to fix them, regardless of what the issues are, whether it's a diversity issue or whether it's some other issue.
Well, and you bring up a good point. Assumptions, that just is never a good thing anyway. If you just make these assumptions without asking, coming back to your model, you got to ask rather than making an assumption that somebody's thinking a certain way. And I hear that a lot where people are like, well, they think this. And it's like, well, if you ask them if that's actually how they think, or you're just assuming. And it's interesting that you talk about because it's kind of like categorizing. We're recategorizing. We're just categorizing them different, supposedly, right? And that's where some people, they get really frustrated because they're called a racist and they're like, what are you talking about? I'm not a racist. Just because of the color of my skin doesn't make me a racist. But there's, and that's like whatever color. I've heard that from,
that's why people are so escalating. We talk about escalation and people not feeling heard and seen and considered as individuals. So when you make an assumption about someone right off the bat, whether you say, you're a racist, or you're rude, or you're aggressive, or you're a chauvinist, or whatever it is, and you don't know anything about them, you're just basing it on essentially some characteristics that you're perceiving about them, or some identity group that you're placing them into. You're essentially dehumanizing them. You're not hearing them or seeing them as individuals. You're just placing them into some category and then making assumptions about their character based on the category you've placed them in. And that's very triggering to people. It makes people feel unseen, unheard, et cetera, and that escalates. So I think, again, it's all about getting to know individuals. Like, don't make an assumption about someone based on the things you perceive about them. Go talk to them, ask them things, figure out who they are, see what their character's like. Don't make judgments about them right off the bat, because that's very dehumanizing.
Yeah. One last question I have for you is gaslighting. I get this a lot where I'll hear people say, oh, they're gaslighting me. And so then they're reacting and all of this is going on.
Yeah.
Do you have any specific advice? And I know we're not doing this live, so I'm thinking about some of the questions that I've gotten or the comments or things that I've seen that have been common that would be relevant to our listeners here. But do you have any recommendations for people that feel like they are being gaslighted?
Okay. Well, depends on the context, I think. So number one, the gaslighting is a major buzzword. And so gaslighting certainly occurs, and it's very frustrating. it's there. I think also gaslighting is a term that's used by people sometimes to get a point across when they're not feeling heard, essentially. So potentially, if someone's saying something and there really is no merit to it, but so it's not being addressed, then they start saying, I'm feeling gaslit or something like that. So we have to be careful about where we use it. But a lot of people that are getting gaslit, and how I would define gaslighting, and I'm looking at the very basic, probably maybe most intense level, which is interpersonal, where you literally are, let's say you have a discussion with someone and you make a plan with them, or you have an agreement with them. And then the next time you see them, they say, what are you talking about? What agreement are you talking about? We never made an agreement. Maybe you thought we did. We didn't. Don't be crazy. You must be crazy. You're like that kind of stuff where it's like your reality is completely being thrown into question. And it's so confusing and almost traumatic for the person because it's happening over and over with this individual or something like that. I've seen this happen with like divorcees that have to like co-parent. And one person is just, every time they make an agreement, the other person like 2 weeks later says, we never made that agreement. I don't know what you're talking about. So it's really frustrating. It's really hard. If you find that's happening at work where it's consistently like someone is saying one thing and then 2 weeks later or a week later, they're just completely forgotten. And you must be crazy. Like, you're creating things in your mind. Like we never talked about that. If that's happening, it's very difficult to change someone's behavior that does that. Because gaslighters are notorious gaslighters and they don't usually change unless they realize they're gaslighters. So what I would say for you is your mental health has to be priority. And what I would suggest is if you're starting to call into question your own reality, you're starting to doubt yourself because this person is making you doubt yourself by always saying that you're crazy or you didn't remember things right or something like that. Start writing things down. Every time that you have a conversation with this person and you make agreements with them or you have write everything down for yourself so that when they say, no, that never happened, you can at least look at your notes and say, know what? It did happen and I'm not crazy. It did happen and I know what I said and I know what I did. And whether or not they want to agree, whether or not they're gonna come around, that's up to them. But I've got to take care of myself. And if someone's notoriously gaslighting, you've got to start making a decision about whether or not you can be in that relationship. If you can separate from the relationship, great. If not, because you're co-parenting or you have a really important job and you don't want to leave it or something, how can you have as least amount of contact and the least amount of emotional ties with that person? Because typically there's no conflict resolution that's going to help in these kinds of situations. Gaslighters there's levels of narcissism and sometimes sociopathology involved in like chronic gaslighting.
Got it. Well, thank you. And I was thinking about one of the things I learned working in tax litigation many years ago was putting everything in writing, what you just talked about, and even sending an email and saying, so just to confirm what we talked about, blah, blah, blah.
With gaslighters, that doesn't even matter though. They won't even, it doesn't even, they'll construe it some other way, but for yourself, for your own mental health, it's important.
Yeah. That's so good. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you notice is really important that we should cover here before we wrap up?
I think I would just reemphasize the idea that we get in most conflicts I've seen, 80%, in terms of interpersonal conflicts in the workplace or an individual in families and stuff. I'm not talking about group conflict because that's more complex, but interpersonal conflict, I would say that it's usually a case that there's some misperception, miscommunication, misunderstanding of intentions, that kind of thing. And so it's really important to get clear. So do your best not to make assumptions. Do your best to separate out what someone's behavior was from your interpretation of that behavior and not make assumptions about their character, et cetera, based on how it's impacted you. So you can go into that space and talk to that person with curiosity, with openness, a sense of collaboration, and asking them what they're experiencing too, and getting clarity, because getting clear and getting aligned with someone is really important. So don't make assumptions. Try to get clear with individuals before you start making assumptions about their character.
Awesome. Jeremy, thank you so much. And I recommend our listeners to go and check out your website, of course, Pollack, peacebuilding.com. check out your book so you can learn. We didn't talk much about you and your own backstory and so forth, but it'll be in there, so that they can learn about that. So Conflict Resolution Playbook, Practical Communication Skills for Preventing, Managing, and Resolving Conflict. Get that book. It's on Amazon, and of course it'll be on the website as well. Jeremy, just thank you. I appreciate it. And then I feel like, as I said, I was trying to allude to with your family, I feel like you live this stuff. This isn't just a good idea. You live this, you breathe this. This is your work. This is your passion. And it's so refreshing. And if there's anything a skill that is important right now in the world that we live in, it is this, is to understand how to resolve conflict, to de-escalate, where it has gone awry. It's so, so important. And so thank you for doing the work that you do.
Yeah. I would say listen to each other. Use your 2 ears twice as much as you use your mouth. Yeah.
There you go.
Listen to each other.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you also to our listeners for tuning in. Again, go to pollackpeacebuilding.com. It'll be in our show notes, and get a copy of Jeremy's book. It'll give you a lot of really practical tools. I think that even if you are not in the workplace, if you are a solo entrepreneur, I think this is essential, because you're going to be interacting with people all the time. And especially, like we talked about, with what's happening, in our society and politically, that there's so much conflict. To be able to learn how to be a peace builder and to reduce the conflict that is happening is so, so important. So I encourage you, leaders of transformation, take action. This is where this material really starts to create transformation in your life, is when you apply it. So I encourage you to apply it. We'd love to hear your stories. You can go on leadersoftransformation.com and you can reach out to us there. You, of course, can follow us on social and share with us what you're doing. If there's something that we can do to help you in furthering your mission and your purpose and what you're doing to create transformation in the world, we'd love to hear that as well. So again, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode real soon.